being here and listening to this story. This has been sort of an interesting journey here in Pennsylvania. So what I'm going to talk about today is setting the foundation, knowing your landscape. Where do you live and what are the possibilities? What about agency support and titles that matter? Agroforestry is a restoration strategy. Someone asked the question already about how agroforestry can be used in restoration. Partnerships are absolutely critical. We have relied so much on people across the country to learning about agroforestry and getting this program on the ground here in Pennsylvania. We're learning as we go. My background, as Gregory said, is in forestry, so I don't know a lot about agriculture, especially not livestock agriculture. So this has been a real journey of education. Absolutely expect some pushback, and I'll talk about that. And what we're working toward is developing a community of practice, networking among people that are practicing agroforestry. So to begin with, in my landscape, the Chesapeake Bay looms large. It's about half of the drainage in Pennsylvania. It's most important because the Bay comes with its own set of initiatives, regulation, task forces, goal implementation. You name it, the Bay has a lot of focus on it here in the Mid-Atlantic, and especially here in Pennsylvania, where 50% of the fresh water to the Bay flows through Pennsylvania. Perhaps the most important part of the story of the Bay and the development of agroforestry here in Pennsylvania is the fact that there is funding available to help implement agroforestry practices on the ground here in Pennsylvania. Specifically, and most focus is on repairing forest buffers, and I'm going to talk a lot about that. So what about Pennsylvania? Pennsylvania is 59% forested and 27% farmland, but what you see when you look at this image is the checkerboard of land uses, and we have dense forests that abut farmlands that have riparian buffers, have hedgerows and windbreaks throughout. But these are the areas that agroforestry can be applied in our landscape. So the geography of place and landscapes inform the placement of that agroforestry on the land. And one of the things that has come up, and I'll bring that up later again, is the watershed equals the food shed. So when we look at where the water flows in the country, in the state, that's also where our food and fiber are produced. So the regulatory landscape. Here in Pennsylvania, we at DCNR are non-regulatory, and the folks that are here in the same building as we are the regulatory agency in the state. So when I started with the Commonwealth in 2004, there were a lot of questions surrounding our DCNR's involvement in the Chesapeake Bay. Although we had a focus and a program that looked at installing riparian forest buffers, we did not have the authority nor the regulatory clout to make that happen. So what we did is we started to look around, where else might trees provide economic and ecological benefits in our landscapes? And then how do we integrate forest management into agricultural systems? Because one of the concerns here in Pennsylvania is not only planting riparian forest buffers, but also maintaining tree cover, whether that's in an urban situation or in a more forested rural situation, the trees are one of the key factors in our water quality in the state. Oh, whoops. So it finally moved. Okay, so it wasn't just us that thought about this. The USDA Agroforestry Strategic Framework cited the benefits of agroforestry practices, provide protection for valuable topsoil, livestock, crops, and wildlife. So windbreaks, holding that soil in place, providing shade for livestock and warming summers, increased productivity of agriculture and horticultural crops, so mitigating some of the microclimate situations, reduce inputs of energy and chemicals, provide water quality, and diversify local economies. So those were the goals of that framework. And then in 2010, an executive order for strategy of protecting and restoring the Chesapeake Bay watershed included developing a strategy by 2012 to maximize forest restoration in priority areas, including lands with agroforestry potential. So when we think back of that image of Pennsylvania and the forests and the agricultural lands bounded by trees, these are the things that we're thinking about with this strategy. So one of the strategies was to provide train-the-trainer workshops that target resource professionals in the watershed as a first step to reach watershed landowners. Subsequent workshops can introduce agroforestry practices to landowners, and that is sort of the bread and butter, or the meat, if you will, of our agroforestry program here in Pennsylvania, is pursuing that educational aspect. So one of the key partners that we had in this process is an organization called Pennsylvania Association for Sustainable Agriculture. And one of our colleagues, Roy Brubaker, who's a farmer and with deep ties to the sustainable agriculture community, first introduced us to this organization. We reasoned that the group was a good place to start messaging, as they are already on board with sustainable practices. So our challenge was to help forest, perennial cover, trees, shrubs become part of that conversation and become integrated in sustainable agricultural practices, as well as in the minds of farmers. One of the things that we started to do was attend the annual conference that PASA has every February, and we started introducing agroforestry programs, had some workshops on agroforestry, and eventually we started sponsoring, the workshops, as well as the conference, and became regular fixtures at the conference. So that was a way for us to reach out to the agricultural community, to the folks that support local agriculture, and have the conversations about the importance of trees in the landscape. So PASA received a grant in 2008 to hold a 2-day pre-conference forestry track. And the focus of that was to build the skill set as a forest farmer. And so a lot of folks have wooded areas on their farms, and looking at ways to utilize those woodlots as something other than dump or occasional firewood harvesting. We brought in Eric Burkhart to talk about establishing and marketing woods-grown ginseng, medicinal plants, and edible mushrooms. We talked about forest ecology. So what is it when you disturb that forest? What happens to the ecology, and how does that affect the macro, micro invertebrates, as well as the animals that support your agriculture? We looked at silviculture methods, timber harvesting, and primary log and timber grading, because timber does remain one of the reasons people maintain their woodlots. And then in 2009, Bern Sweeney from the Stroud Water Resource Center was the keynote speaker and was so impressed with what he heard at the conference, that the landowners talking, the farmers talking about sustainability and their connection to the land and the health of the soil and the water. And he came up with the idea that a watershed equals a food shed, which is something that I mentioned earlier. When we think about our landscape, it's not just these individual silos of activity. There are multiple applications. So in 2010, the year after Dr. Sweeney presented, we had a 2-day pre-conference forestry track, harvesting the back 40. I'm sure others have heard that expression, but that's something my dad always talked about. That was the woodlot, the back 40 that you wasn't really part of the main farm. So here the topics included sustainable farming from the top down. What's going on in the canopy? When you look at the top of the tree of the forest, how does that light affect what you're doing on the ground? Navigating the marketplace, working with consulting foresters. Many of us have woodlots and forests to work with, but who do you trust, and how does that process work? We felt that was important. Chainsaw safety and directional felling is paramount. Just because you have a chainsaw doesn't mean that you know how to use it safely, and it's really critical if you're managing your woodlots. Integrating horse logging and sugar bush management. Silvopasturing. So that's something we're going to hear more about, because that was a hot button issue here in Pennsylvania, as it is in much of the Northeast. How to grow, harvest, manage, and market nut crops. We had Mike Gold from the University of Missouri come out and talk to us about nut crops. Exploring the forest understory and introduction to the stepovers. So when you're walking through your woodlot, what else is out there? What are the things that you step over that have either medicinal or food values? And then gardening like the forest, deep ecosystem design for gardeners and agroforesters. That was with, we actually brought Dave Jackie in to talk about some different approaches to multi-story cropping. So in 2010, the Forest Service Chesapeake Bay grant was given to Penn State in cooperation with our agency, DCNR Bureau of Forestry. And the target audiences for this were the technical service providers, natural resource professionals, farmers, woodland owners, professional consulting foresters, as well as loggers. So the idea is to reach out to the people that talk to landowners and farmers and inform them about agroforestry and what the potential is and how that might apply to their interactions with their constituents. So the results, we had 8 trainings, we had 217 participants. 21 of our Pennsylvania's 67 counties participated. We had 5 states, and 8 different organizations were represented through this grant process. This is one of the examples. It was a working landscape for water and ecology, and Dr. Jim Finley from Penn State and Dr. Eric Burkhardt, also from Penn State, worked with a local farmer on a tour of the sugar bush. Participants got to actually install the taps. They got to watch the process of boiling down the maple syrup, as well as enjoy the fruits of their labor, if you will, by eating products using that maple syrup. And in the meantime, there I am as the Watershed Coordinator. That was my original title, because we decided that didn't quite fit that transition to Reforestation Coordinator, because at the time I was working very closely with the American Chestnut Foundation, looking at mineland reclamation, looking for places on the landscape where we could plant trees, which inevitably moved to the Agroforestry Coordinator. And so that was a huge transition. And so now I'm going to change to my boss's voice, because my boss, Rachel Reyna, presented at the SAF conference, I think it was 3 years ago, talking about this transition and the evolution of agroforestry in Pennsylvania. So, as I said, I started out as the Watershed Coordinator, and then we changed my title to Reforestation Coordinator. Well, my boss had a discussion with her boss about changing my title once again, this time to Agroforestry Coordinator. After she described what she saw were the benefits of doing this, he allowed us to give it a try. And here I'm quoting, and I have to say that this ended up being a great decision. These are Rachel's words, not mine. Because as it turns out, names really do matter. This title change did not alter my workload at all. It did change my job description a bit, but what it did was very significant. As it turns out, Rachel says, names really do matter. So it begins in earnest. We've got the title, now what? So we have permission to do the work. We have the authority in the subject matter. So even though I'm still learning, I have been able to make those networks, develop those networks, so I can, if I don't have an answer, I know someone that does. Pay for the necessary training. That's enabled me to travel to the Midwest and the Northeast to learn more about agroforestry and to network with our cooperators and our mentors across the country. It helps me to better focus my work. I'm not working solely on riparian buffers. I'm not spending quite as much time focusing on the Chesapeake Bay, but working locally. It's an energized new program. This is unique, we feel, in the country, having the agroforestry title within this state. And it's a spotlight on our agency and the work. So having that title has really helped us to focus. So what's our role as a state agency? The reason I'm here today is to talk about what we're doing and why we feel it's important, and hopefully start a dialogue. How do we make this program or assist our neighboring states and maybe moving a program forward for them? So what we look at is our role is bringing partners together. Networking is critical. Promotion and creation of demonstration areas, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Promoting collective success. So yeah, we're in this together and seeing the successes on the land and seeing our folks respond to this program has been really wonderful. It helps us to apply for grants. We have a focus. We are able to talk specifically about agroforestry and its benefits to the different grantors. And we create and sponsor workshops and other training opportunities. That's been sort of the bread and butter of what we've done, as you've already seen, but there's more. Okay. Well, as I mentioned, you can expect opposition. And again, these are going to be words from my boss, but she says there were people that were not happy with what we were doing, even though we had some great things in the work. Some of this was predictable, some of it wasn't. And the truth is, whenever you start something new, you should expect opposition. A good bit of our opposition was actually internal from foresters in our bureau, so it hit close to home, and sometimes it was quite personal. We are fortunate that none of this opposition came from the top of our organization. Our bureau director at that time happened to do his master's thesis in the agroforestry realm, as that might have shut things down. What we found is that most of our issues were coming from people that had heard the term agroforestry and had the knee-jerk reaction related to their feelings about silvopasture. Silvopasture is and remains and was that hot button issue. So they're thinking, what, are you saying it's okay to run cows in the woods now? Are you saying to let people run their hogs again and degrade our forests, as you see in the image on the left there? So our foresters were imagining the horror of our agency promoting unsustainable woods overrun with cows, and others having nightmares of feral swine being linked to conservation practices that we were funding. So, in other words, the anti-conservation aspects. So, how do we get through it? Well, we remind people that agroforestry is more than silvopasture. And education. First thing that we had to do is keep in mind that these folks that were opposing us were doing so with good intention toward natural resources and not personal attacks. We began reminding people that agroforestry is more than silvopasture. And so don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And through this, we continued educating professional staff. This was key. This is a workshop that we had on a farm in Juniata County. It was one of our service foresters helped to coordinate it, and Brett Chedsoy and Pete Smallage from Cornell came down and spoke to this audience. As you can see from the expressions, people were pretty intent on what they were, what Brett was saying. You may see some level of skepticism, but in fact, many of these people in this photograph ended up being supportive and ended up helping us to pursue education in the counties where they work. Ironically, one of the first agroforestry trainings I went to, I attended outside our agency, was a silvopasture conference, and that's Brett Chedsoy with his bull. It was hosted by Cornell Cooperative Extension, and it was successful in its intent in bringing together the types of people who could be important in silvopasture, including folks from pioneers, actually, in agroforestry from the University of Missouri. Next, I had the opportunity and the privilege to attend the inaugural Agroforestry Academy at the University of Missouri. There I met a lot of people that would become very important to our developing agroforestry program here in Pennsylvania, including Kate McFarland, Mike Gold, Keith Keeley. So all of these folks that help inform agroforestry and the things that we're doing here in Pennsylvania. And in fact, Dr. Gold was instrumental in helping us to get the Northeast SARE grant that I'll talk about in a minute. In the meantime, there's agroforestry going on everywhere. So we have convened a meeting of the Chesapeake Bay Agroforestry team, and these are team members from USDA, NRCS, Forest Service, different state agencies, Penn State researchers, and we all convened on a mountain in Pennsylvania and came up with a plan and how we're going to pursue agroforestry in our region, obviously with the Chesapeake Bay focus. So, number one, creating a community of practice with clear, unified message to help gather support from agency leaders. Engaging resource professionals in agroforestry. How do we teach people what agroforestry is? How do we help them find materials and find experts in the field that can help support them as they reach out to landowners? Creating incentives. What are the potential incentives to install agroforestry systems on different landscapes? Network building among disciplines. So in this picture we have the grazing lands conservationists, we have foresters, we have a poultry professor, we have foresters, we have social scientists. So we have a whole lot of different disciplines represented within this group. And with that, regularly scheduled trainings for resource professionals, which is something that, again, is coming up. So, demonstration areas. Strong and Jacobson in 2006 published research that found that that study of PA farmers and landowners that 90% would consider adopting agroforestry if information were made available and they can see working demonstrations. So creating demonstration areas became very important as one of the actions outlined in the agroforestry section of the Chesapeake Bay Forest Restoration Strategy is to establish agroforestry demonstration areas by finding early adopters with working farms and forests so that we can see the conservation and economic benefits of agroforestry practices. So those were marching orders. Those were things that helped direct the work we're doing here. So one of the first things we did was a USDA grant. This was a Northeast SARE Partnership Grant advancing on-farm understanding and application of silvopasture technologies in Pennsylvania. This is a site in Chester County on Wybrook Farm that was thinned in order to establish forage. The farmer's intention was to keep some of that forest canopy, but also to establish forage for his cattle. And for closer to home here in central Pennsylvania, Dickinson College Farm was a recipient of funding through this grant and also some Chesapeake Bay money, and their intention was to establish forage in part of their woodlot to demonstrate how that would work, as well as to plant trees in an existing pasture. And those of you who have tried to put 1.5-inch caliper trees in with big animals and try to protect them, it is a challenge. And so we went through a number of different iterations about fencing and protecting the trees, but I think this was planted 2010, 11 maybe. And many of those trees still exist, and the goals of the farmer here were several. They raised bees, so they wanted pollinator species. So we planted black locust and honey locust and some different blooming species, as well as things like hares. They wanted some forage to fall, and it's the other factor that they were looking for was aesthetic. So again, the flowers were important. They wanted their pasture to be attractive. There's a walking path right adjacent to that field, and so aesthetics were important to them. So back to buffers, that still remains the bread and butter of the work we do here in the Chesapeake Bay, but we're thinking about ways that we could incorporate productivity in our buffers. So one of the arguments or one of the concerns that landowners and farmers often have is that they're going to lose the use of their land. So this is an image actually from the National Agroforestry Center. I think it's Gary Bentrup's that demonstrates how we're looking at multifunctional buffers. So the first bit of it here in Pennsylvania, we're talking about 15 feet. Zone 2 is another 20 feet, and these can be managed for fruit and nut trees and shrubs. And for our programs, we don't allow mechanical harvesting within that first 35 feet. However, outside the 35 feet, you can manage it for woody, florals, and forbs. And just yesterday, I was in a conference that was really focusing on that third zone and thinking about switchgrass as a potential supplemental income on that zone 3, as well as helping to provide some of that water quality mitigation. I had a chance to look at some questions that came in before this presentation, and one of them was about establishing native species in Pennsylvania. Are we working to use native species in agroforestry? And in fact, we are. So this graphic actually was one of our interns who did that. Those are the zones I'm talking about. And we have a little booklet that we put together talking about edible floral riparian plants. And what we're primarily focused on, especially in the first 2 zones, is native plants. So this is a guide that can help direct you as to plants to select for those zones. But how else can we get folks engaged? One of the wonderful things, at least I think, about having these multifunctional buffers and planting edible buffers and planting floral buffers is ownership and engagement and paying attention to what's going on in that buffer. So often we plant restoration or conservation plantings and they're ignored. So the idea is to engage people. Gosh, what's blooming? What's edible? What can we harvest now? And what can we do with that? So one of the projects that we're working for, in partnership with the Pennsylvania Association for Sustainable Agriculture is putting together conservation cookbook. This is focused on streams and species that grow on riparian zones, pawpaws, persimmons, hazelnuts, black walnuts, things that that are common and native to our watersheds. So that's been a really interesting project, and one of the things that we just had to do is test some of the recipes that came in, and so we could photograph them for the cookbook. We hope to have this out early January in time for Pennsylvania's Farm Show, and we hope to have it available also at the PASA conference this year. So again, reaching out to communities. I think Rich Straight at the National Agroforestry Center brought that back from, brought a booklet back from North Dakota talking about windbreak cookbooks. So in the Midwest, one of the primary agroforestry practices is windbreaks, and among the things that are planted in those windbreaks are edible species. So we're shamelessly borrowing from our colleagues in the upper Midwest and putting a little different face on it and looking at riparian species. And oh, by the way, if you have a recipe you'd like to contribute, please send it to me. We're still assembling that cookbook. And speaking of multifunctional buffers, this is another project at Dickinson College Farm in Cumberland County, Pennsylvania. Some of you may have heard of a creek called the Yellow Breeches, and this pasture is right adjacent to the stream. And what they've planted there is in the large trees that you see emerging from the tubes are sycamores, but they also have pawpaws, persimmons, hazels, winterberry holly. This photograph is from several years ago, but right now the winterberry is just glorious. And the folks at Dickinson have a CSA and also have a table at the local farmers market. And so these are items that they can begin to sell off this multifunctional riparian forest buffer. Another aspect of agroforestry that we are engaged in and working with Penn State on, as well as USDA, is creating vegetative environmental buffers. And Paul Patterson is a poultry professor who spearheaded this work. Here on the left you see DCNR volunteers planting buffers alongside large poultry houses, and the purpose of those is microclimate mitigation, but also to capture the particulate matter that comes out of those big fans on those chicken houses. And additionally, creating a vegetated screen that will screen out the chicken houses from adjoining neighbors. A lot of these are in Lancaster County, which is the most agricultural county in the state, but it's also rapidly growing. So you'll have neighbors that just moved in, love the visual of this open space and farms, but really aren't interested in the noise and dust and odors that come from agricultural practices. So planting these buffers helps mitigate some of that. So coming to what's really happening right now, this is pretty exciting. So 2015, we established the Northeast Mid-Atlantic Working Group, and struggles and creating networks, and how is this actually going to work out? Who's going to do what? How can we work across jurisdictions and states and distances? Even though we're in the Northeast and the distances aren't quite as large as we might find in the Midwest or further west, it's kind of difficult for us to get together. So how are we going to work in the region and help promote and help inform each other about agroforestry. And so this was started just a couple weeks ago. A number of us met in New York State and came up with some guidelines and some next steps is how can we help make this a functioning group. So, agroforestry in practice, training for service providers. One of the things that we did, we were inspired by the Midwest Agroforestry Academy, and so we applied for a Northeast SARE grant to hold trainings. And while the trainings in Missouri and Minnesota were 5 days, we opted to do 3 days. And so we had 30 people come to the inaugural training in Biglerville, which is in the heart of apple country. And we learned about nut crops, we learned about chestnut restoration, we learned about silvopasture. We toured, on the left you can see this is a native plant nursery that was established in the understory of the farmer's home property. They started out as a hobby and ended up with 7 acres of different spring ephemerals and shade-tolerant species. So we visited that. We visited a site where the vegetative buffers had been planted on poultry houses in adjacent Adams County. So this was the beginning of a conversation we heard about from landowners that established multifunctional buffers on their property. And the audience was pretty mixed. We had a number of agency staffs as well as NGOs and actually teachers. So the following year we moved up to New York and had a training that Cornell Cooperative Extension held. It was an amazing tour. Brett Chedsoy and Steve Gabriel were key in helping to put this together. We got to tour sugar bush, sample different kinds of maple, walnut, butternut syrups, and visit a cidery where they were practicing alley cropping using apples, asparagus, and turkeys. So not all at the same time, but as the season succeeded. We also visited Akiva Silver's tree nursery and learned about how to propagate trees in unique ways. So all of this leading up to what's going on now and what has the impact been here in Pennsylvania. So one of the things we've started is what my boss calls the Agroforestry Brain Trust. And it's a small group, roughly 20 people. We have members from our Department of Ag, we have consulting foresters, we have farmers on board, we have our own agency staffs, we have NGOs, so Pennsylvania Certified Organic is represented. They are the folks that also have the forest grown verification program for medicinals such as ginseng and ramps and golden seal. So we've got this group together. We've met once. We aim to meet twice a year and inform the direction of agroforestry here in the state. The Tioga County Agroforestry Working Group was just established. One of our members, and actually one of the first, a woman that participated in the first agroforestry training that we had in Biglerville is a an environmental planner in Tioga County and helped spearhead this working group. So that just started. The American Chestnut Foundation, the Pennsylvania chapter, applied for and received a Pennsylvania Department of Ag specialty product grant to explore the opportunities and the possibilities of establishing chestnut co-op here in Pennsylvania by looking at models in states like Michigan and Ohio. Mifflin and Snyder counties sponsored agroforestry workshops. So this is coming from the conservation districts actually moving forward and finding that agroforestry could be valuable to their constituents and moving that forward. One of the other things that we've seen is that through our trainings, we've had consulting foresters and others that began their own consulting businesses, looking at agroforestry, looking at repairing buffers, looking at establishing alley crops on the land. And it's really satisfying to see how these trainings that we've had help inspire folks to go out and start their own businesses and get the work on the ground. When with that, this image is my collection of goods from the woods. I have gathered products that are made from native species throughout my travels. Not all of them are from Pennsylvania, and one of the goals of our specialty crops person at the Department of Ag is I want to have them all from Pennsylvania. So that's going to be a challenge. Who's out there producing it? Who's processing? Where are the processors? Who are the growers? And those are the next steps that we're looking at. With that, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Thank you, Tracy. Thanks so much. That was a great presentation. For those with us participating, what we're going to do is we're going to open a Q&A box. We have some time for question and answers, so I'm going to open that up. You'll see in your screen here this Q&A box, and for participants, you should see a dialogue box at the bottom there that you can enter in any questions. So I might get things started as we're waiting for some of those questions to come in. Tracy, I'm curious and maybe you touched on this and I didn't quite get it, but in terms of funding, how you're able to fund your role as agroforestry coordinator and related programs. Is it from the core budget, core funding through your agency, and they've been able to create this position, or are you continually needing to go after short-term funding or grants to continue the bulk of this work?
All of the above, I think, would be the answer. My salary is funded through the state. Different programs are funded through the state, at least in part. There's grant funding through organizations like NIFWIF, Chesapeake Bay program. We apply for outside grants. Northeast Sierra has been a tremendous partner in moving this forward, has funded farmer grants to study chestnuts, again, the silvopasture, as well as our training. So yes, those are
in addition to the initial major Northeast Sierra grant that funded the regional agroforestry program and training that you mentioned. So there's been additional support from Northeast Sierra for producer grants and other related activities. And I guess, as you mentioned, you had the support of your supervisors, Rachel Rayna and others, that I guess were able to not exactly create a new position, but transform or rename an existing position. That, as you mentioned, made all the difference. I'm just really impressed at how you've worked together in building partnerships and really laid down a whole infrastructure foundation for agroforestry in Pennsylvania and throughout the region. Let's take a look at maybe there's one question coming in, first question by Michael Cooley asking about if there's any comments on buy-in or to alley cropping on Pennsylvania farms.
So I have comments about about alley cropping. I wish we could see more of it. I think it's a great system, but I don't know about buy-in. One of the things that we've talked about recently is implementing that alley cropping in riparian forest buffer systems, because there's a lot of pushback to planting woody buffers. But if we could integrate grasses or forages between the rows of trees, that might be one of the approaches. But are you in Pennsylvania? I can't talk to you, Michael, but just curious. I would love to hear more about your thoughts about alley cropping and how we could make that more mainstream, because I think it's a practice that's often effective.
Yeah, unfortunately we can't right now enable your mic, Michael, but you can respond with further questions or comments in this or the comment box. I noticed there's a few questions coming over in the other chat box. And Eric B., I'm going to guess that's Eric Burkhardt, I'm thinking. No, it's not. It's a different. Okay, but he does ask about what are the best places to get training for new agroforesters, especially young entrepreneurs, and it's Eric Boudreau. So training for new agroforesters. Well, I think maybe you take that, but I think some of the trainings that you mentioned or have hosted or have coming online in the future. Tracey, any thoughts for Eric Boudreau about training for new agroforesters?
I'm not sure where Eric is. I think he might be in Pennsylvania. But if he would be interested in getting on a list that we could inform him of any upcoming trainings, I'd be happy to do that. Again, you have my contact information, I think.
So Eric
at the end of the presentation.
Sorry, go ahead, Tracey.
So
just maybe to follow up on that, Eric, Tracey's contact information is available there at the end of the presentation. But it should also mention that there are other resources for agroforestry training, including the one-week intensive agroforestry academy that the University of Missouri offers each summer. But you very likely would find more local resources there in the Northeast, and I think Tracey's the best point of contact for that. And also check in on the NEMO website for upcoming events and trainings. Let's move on to Francis Smith's question there. He's a tech with the Maryland Forest Service, and he's looking at getting some forest farming demo sites started there in Maryland, and is asking about whether you found a successful technique for wildlife exclusion, specifically birds who,
that is a very good question, and in one short word, I'd say no. One of the challenges of planting these crops is that if you plant them, they will come. So folks have talked about fencing with the birds. Gosh, I mean, netting is something that you can use that comes with its own challenges. I've seen folks growing blueberries actually building cages and netting them. So yeah, that's definitely a challenge. Yeah, I mean, my brother's a cherry farmer. He's got the same problem. Everything loves to eat these.
Well, on forest farming more generally, there are quite a bit of resources there in the Mid-Atlantic. Some of the work that's gone on in Virginia Tech, some folks at Cornell and there in Pennsylvania. So through the Beginning Forest Farming Network, the Appalachian Beginning Forest Farming Network, and even through the NEMA website, you could link into some of those resources and trainings on forest farming and the community of practice around that. Do you see any other questions there?
So,
Yes, go ahead.
also, I'm sorry. With the Maryland Forest Service, I'm thinking of Frostburg State, and I'm thinking of Sunshine Brosey, who is very involved with forest farming and native plants. So that would be a good resource. If you haven't already checked with Frostburg, that would be a good connection as well locally.
Thank you, Tracy. There's a few more questions there. Is there anyone in particular that you'd like to address? Questions from Bodega Bashaw and from Chris about forest management plans?
How can we involve, gosh,
That's a big question.
That's something we can talk about, but this is something I think what's happening is leading by example, working on the conversation. One of the things that I just heard now, Kate McFarland is up in Vermont from the National Agroforestry Center, but they're looking at having a training in Vermont, and this is involving the Departments of Forestry and Agriculture. So continuing the conversation, building advocacy among the constituents and the practitioners, I think is really important to helping move this forward within the different agencies.
Right. Yeah. That's a pretty big, as I mentioned, big question, a challenge for all of us around the country in the different regions of how to move this along and foster great. Go ahead.
So Chris and agroforestry components. So one of the folks that I mentioned that attended our trainings is a consulting forester, and she wrote an agroforestry plan. We've actually got a tree farm plan written, designed around agroforestry. So we are starting that. There is a lot of interest in our field foresters in learning more about agroforestry, certain aspects, certainly forest farming, repairing forest buffers, and the different species that could be integrated into systems. So I would say just, again, that conversation, having those thoughts, because it's how we move it forward.
Thank you, Tracy. There's a follow-up question from Chris below, and see if you want to address this for the specifics in Pennsylvania. Does Pennsylvania have its own funded cost share program, or do most landowners participate through EQIP or other federal funded programs?
So we do have grant programs for the riparian forest buffer component. There are practices through EQIP that can be funded. I think multi-story cropping is one of them. I think hedgerows, windbreaks, and one of the things is pollinator habitat, or things that come to mind that could be funded. Here in Pennsylvania, certainly silvopasture is not funded. Trying to think what else. But the others, I think windbreaks for pollution, as you saw with the poultry houses, are also something that could be funded, but we don't fund that.
I think we maybe have time for a bit more. We're past the hour, but if folks want to stay on for another minute or few while we continue this. One final question.
Sorry, I'm reading
Yeah, you see that one?
Francis Smith's comment. Yeah, so what's reasonable for a forest farm? Actually, what's manageable? So I think that probably depends on the landowner. If you can manage, a a few trees that are going to supplement your market basket at your farmer's market. That might be it to start with. Again, a lot of people are already busy, so I think that the better question is what can they manage and what are they willing to manage, because we can plant acres, as we know, of buffers, for example, that are neglected because that's not part of the farm. So yeah, what can they fit in their lives is I think
That's pretty
the
sound
proper
advice
answer.
with any new endeavor or enterprise to maybe start small. Certainly in the forest farming with like a shiitake mushroom operation, you might want to start small as an add-on and see how it goes before going big scale. I think we're probably coming to the end here. Maybe just one comment following up on Chris's questions about Pennsylvania having its own funded cost share programs. That yeah, it does vary from state to state, and even the NRCS programming and standard practices, whatever the state technical committee adopts. So it will vary, even the NRCS programming from state to state, and but there are other perhaps opportunities on a state-by-state basis as well. For example, Missouri, the state NRCS committee has created a specially dedicated fund for agroforestry. I think it's the first state to do it, and so we're fortunate to have that. And there's also other cost share programs through the State Department of Natural Resources implemented through the county soil and water conservation districts, and some of those are relevant or could be used for agroforestry practices. Just to give you an example. Tracy, how are we doing? Any other questions there you see that you might want to address, or I think we're coming to the end of the.
No, I think we've
Well, then,
covered them.
I want to thank you so much, Tracy, for a really excellent presentation. It really is quite informative and helps us think about how to these excellent examples of how you've done things in Pennsylvania and the Northeast, and some lessons for elsewhere around the country. So thank you for that, and thanks to everyone who joined us today for the participating in the presentation. Just to remind you that all this presentation and all previous webinars in the series have been recorded and are available on the Center for Agroforestry.org website for viewing, for on-demand viewing. You would go to the webinar tab on the Center for Agroforestry.org website, and there you will also see schedule and information for future webinars. So please join us again in the future. Enjoy the upcoming holidays, and thanks so much to everyone. Take care.